Hi everyone, this is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today I'm going to do a little birth chart demonstration. My office is completely deconstructed. I am sitting on, sitting on a mattress in a mostly empty house while a little bit of work is being done on the house before we move. Kind of try to get it ready for the next people. So today I thought I would do a birth chart demonstration. I hope that this might be useful for you. There are some people here doing some like touch-up painting, so if there's some banging around in the background, I apologize for the noise. I've got my next 1-year program begins in November. It meets on Saturdays at noon Eastern time. So I hope to see some of you there. The early bird rate is already in effect. Need-based tuition is there if you're struggling due to COVID. We're keeping it open again as we did during the spring program. So check it out on my website, nightlightastrology.com. Hope to see some of you there in class soon. What I'm trying to do somewhat regularly is to provide birth chart demos. This one actually comes from one of my classroom experiences that we had last weekend. In order to help people who are studying at home get a little bit of help, not everyone has either the time or the money, even with the different kinds of discounts we provide to take a class. So if you're studying on your own, hopefully this is helpful to you. And otherwise, I do this also to demo for people the kinds of concepts and techniques that we look at in class, and hopefully give you some preview of what you might be learning more about in my programs. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a few basic techniques that you can apply when looking at any birth chart. Any of these techniques, I should qualify by saying, can become very elaborate and more nuanced and sophisticated. There's many factors to kind of consider when looking at different placements in a birth chart. So I'm going to give you some very basic tips, but I qualify that by saying that there's a lot that'll be left out here. And if you're a more intermediate student of astrology, you may notice that I'm not addressing certain things. But okay, let's go ahead. So this is the chart of a woman who came into my classroom last weekend. We had a really nice reading together. A big part of my programs are that I like to read for people live in the classroom and give them a sense of, what is, I like my students to see what we're studying actually put into action. So here's what we did. First of all, when assessing a birth chart in ancient astrology, one of the things that we pay a lot of attention to is whether you were born during the daytime or the nighttime. If you were born during the daytime, then the Sun, Saturn, and Jupiter are considered to be of the sect. One of the analogies that's sometimes used, that's quite frequently used, is that the planets that are in sect in your chart are a little bit like the political party that has control of the Senate or the Congress or something like that. It's more easy to pass the legislation or the laws that your party wants to pass when it's in power. Otherwise, your results will be more compromised. So when assessing the sect of a chart, we look to see if the sun is above or below the horizon line defined by the ascendant and descendant, the degrees of the zodiac that intersect with the eastern and western horizons. In this case, we're looking at the ascendant at 4 Gemini, the descendant at 4 Sagittarius, and what we notice is that the sun, relative to these placements, is below the horizon on the bottom of the chart. So this is a nighttime chart. So that means that the moon and Venus and Mars are the planets that are in sect. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they're good or better or anything. It's just telling us that these planets may have more ease in expressing themselves and whatever they're saying in the birth chart. They're less compromised results. Now, but look at what they're saying, right? We have the moon in its traditional sign of its fall or depression in Scorpio, a place that's a little bit difficult for the moon. Venus is the same way in Scorpio, the sign of its exile or detriment. And then Mars, the third sect mate, who actually is the dispositor or host for the moon and Venus in Scorpio by virtue of the fact that it rules the sign of Scorpio. And here's Mars in Cancer, also in the sign of its depression or fall. So these conditions immediately speak pretty strongly in this chart. So what does it mean? Well, one way of breaking up the reading of a chart will have to do with looking at the sect, kind of gathering some information like we have here. The sects, these planets of the sect in favor, they really stand out. They tell a story that looks like it could be kind of difficult. There's a little bit of mitigation here. For example, Mars, Venus, and the moon are in a trine with each other, and there's actually mutual reception by debility from the moon and Mars. Mars is in the moon sign and moon is in Mars's sign, and they're in a really close trine with one another. So some good may come out of whatever they're saying, even if there's some difficulty involved. But you got an initial message of what looks like it could be some difficulty. What to speak of the fact that the moon and Venus are in the 6th house, which traditionally was also a more challenging place. It was called the joy of Mars and the house of bad fortune. There's a lot more to be said about the 6th house. Nothing's black and white in ancient astrology, despite what sometimes, despite how it may appear sometimes by some of the language. But we'll come back to that in a minute. So you look at these planets and you go, okay, like these planets are really they're really loud. They're painting a really strong story. And so we need to start there and figure out what they're saying. The universal signification of the sun, the moon, and the ascendant, I use in almost every birth chart reading as a way of framing the reading for a client. So for example, in this case, the moon as a universal significator is going to represent the environment of life. The kinds of things that you're born into that you don't feel like you have control over, whether it's, race or ethnicity or time in history that you're born, socioeconomic status of the family that you're born into, genetics, hereditary, kind of these predispositions that are sort of inborn and so forth. We don't feel like we have a lot of control over those things. They're more almost like features of the psychic or karmic environment that you're born into. And the moon, as the ruler of fortune in ancient astrology, could easily depict those things. So then we start by saying, what is the environment of this lifetime? And we can see that through the moon in its fall, with Venus in her exile in the 6th house, with the dispositor or host and sektmate Mars in its fall in the 2nd house. Now let's break that down a little bit more. So the environment of the life defined by a moon in its fall in the 6th house could be characterized by hardships, specifically related to things like women or mothers, mothering, maybe the topic of women's health, mental, emotional health of women and mothers. You also have the theme of socioeconomic hardship potentially, because the moon, Venus are hosted by Mars, who is in its fall in the 2nd house of money and finances. So immediately these were some of the things that came to mind. Now, again, not all is lost here. What could some of the positive traits be? Well, the 6th house was called the house of bad fortune. It was the joy of Mars. It's that house that has to do with hardship and strife and difficulty and how we meet it with either resilience or perseverance or hard work or labor. It's not easy to deal with the toils or struggles of the 6th house. It's a bit like, right now with moving, got a lot of boxes, there's a lot of work, there's a lot of lifting, there's a lot of sweating, it's August, So that feeling of like, oh man, I just feel like I'm slaving away, in the heat of the sun with stuff I really don't like to do. It can be as simple as that. Or it can be as real as actual slavery, which was associated with the 6th house, which is why it was called the difficult house. It can also be related to chronic disease and chronic health problems, as well as those who may give their life in sacrifice or service to a cause or a mission, people who are in the military. All of these different themes or topics were related to the 6th house, even people who would be like battlefield medics or surgeons or people who work in healthcare, who work in an environment that features stress and difficulty and hardship, but maybe they work as a healer or a caregiver or something like that. So the moon in this place, even though it's debilitated with Venus, could also speak to someone who is a feminist, who works with women, who works in environments where there is both a combination of maybe violence or hardship or difficulty, but also the need for nurturing and mothering and healing. There's a kind of mama bear energy with Mars in the mix, you could say, in Cancer, the moon sign. So you can blend these very same qualities and talk about persevering, feminine, protective, kind of warrior energies. We don't want to ever whitewash a chart and take out what the clear signs of difficulty or challenge might be, but we also don't want to paint those challenges as if there are not virtues and blessings contained within them. So we see Mars as the dispositor in its fall in the second house. It's very possible that the theme of being a single parent or of socioeconomic challenges related to women and children or to poverty in the home and family, persevering and having to work through such things, kind of that working class and the hardships of working class life, especially around, again, probably the topics of women or health, things like that. So this is where I started. Now that's the environment of the life. And again, just kind of painting a broad picture here. Next, let's go to the next universal significator in the chart, which is the sun. And the sun is usually going to tell us more about the life in terms of a story or plot line. For example, the sun is related to the concept of the daimon, which is like the guardian spirit. Doing another talk on the daimon later this week. Guardian spirit that kind of guides and compels our action, and represents a sense of plot line, ambition, purpose, and action towards something that the life is taking on. For example, the analogy that's often used is like the acorn is to the oak tree. So each of us have a kind of sense of something that we're trying to become, some plot line that shapes our life, and the sun is usually that. Sometimes people think of themselves as their sun sign. In ancient astrology, the sun had more to do with action in the world and something that you're doing, not something that you are. The ascendant was generally gave a better depiction of that. In this case, the ascendant ruler Mercury is with the sun in the fifth house. Now you'll notice, if you're a little bit more advanced, that I'm not going to talk about the dignity of the sun in its fall or the fact that Mercury is combust and retrograde. I'm going to keep it really simple for now. The life plot line and story is as simple as saying, look, it has something to do with the fifth house. What does that mean? Well, the fifth house generally was called the joy of Venus and the house of good fortune, is related to things like creativity and the arts. It's a big one in modern astrology that we talk a lot about. But also anything that's pleasing or pleasant or enjoyable. And it's also associated with things like children and procreation, pregnancy. The other thing that is interesting is that the fifth house is the second house from the fourth house. If you start from the fourth house and use what are called derived houses, counting off, the second house from the fourth is the fifth. This means that the assets, money, resources, business of the father or of the parents or family can be a topic pertaining to the fifth house. Well, sometimes you'll see that the fifth house sun is also related very intimately to what the parents do for a living, to what one's life path may have something in common with one's parents. This was one of the possibilities that I included in the breakdown of the fifth house sun. But one of the things we could see from a fifth house sun is someone whose life is geared towards creativity and the arts, maybe something to do with the parents or their lineage or legacy financially or professionally. It may also have something to do very generally with with Libra being represented there. It's a Venus ruled sign, so again the topic of the arts, but could also be intellectual in nature. Libra is usually pretty refined intellectually and may be very good with people. Libra is usually quite the diplomatic type of person, and sometimes there's a concern with fairness or equality and things like that. But these were the topics that I said may very clearly define the life path. Okay, so now one of the things that I mentioned here that stood out to me in the reading as well. There's lots of things that I talked about in this reading, but one of the things that stood out very clearly to me is that you have Saturn with the south node in the midheaven in her 9th house. Now Saturn's out of sect here, which may mean that it's harder for Saturn to kind of legislate its agenda. But the south node is of the nature of Saturn, and the south node Saturn in the 9th house usually point to something a little bit monastic, a very disciplined, serious gravitas that is expressed in the life oftentimes through someone who has a lot of higher education, or who's involved in the law or legal system in some way, or who has perhaps some spiritual discipline or religious piety, so to speak, that could be a real anchor for them. Now, Saturn is not going to be perfectly easy, but what I like about this is that Saturn has a trine to the Sun in the 5th house, which tells me that the life path is also going to include these 9th house matters. And I would think that that would mean someone who's well educated and artistic or creative, or someone who is both creative and spiritual or religious, and that there's a real serious and disciplined and mature side of them. This is going to help a lot. Why is this going to help a lot? Because look at the environment that we've discussed. The environment through the Moon, Venus, and Mars could certainly present a lot of challenges. We've already mentioned what those could be. What I'm seeing here is that the juxtaposition could tell us that this person will have a way of surviving and persevering and thriving, doing something creative with also maybe like a degree of religious, spiritual, or academic, discipline or sort of high-mindedness or faith that will be a real anchor for them. So these are the things that I mentioned in the reading. And now I'd like to tell you a little bit about this person. So, one of the things that obviously a reading is about more than just telling someone what kinds of storylines have defined their life already. We want to talk about what do these storylines mean to you now, and where are things going in the future? What kinds of transits are coming up? For example, with this client, we spent quite a bit of time talking about their upcoming Saturn return in Aquarius, which will be her 2nd Saturn return. That was a really good topic of conversation. We also talked about the upcoming opposition from Pluto to her natal Mars in Cancer. It's another big one. And we also talked about the eclipses coming through in her 1st and 7th houses in the year and a half ahead. So there's a lot to talk about. But getting this context of the natal chart down, we can make sense of the core storylines that whatever we're looking at going forward will relate back to. So in this case, this woman had grown up with a single mother in really difficult socioeconomic conditions. There's back to that moon in the 6th house, and the trine to the ruler Mars in its fall in the 2nd house. Her mother was a dancer, and she was also diagnosed as a schizophrenic. So she grew up with a single mother who had a very serious mental health challenge, and she was also very artistic. Now her father was a set designer for theater and film, if I remember correctly. It might have been just theater. So we also have, remember that both parents were artists, and we were talking about the sun as a life path that may have something to do with art. So we'll come back to that in a second. But she grew up with single mother in like close to the poverty level, and who was had a mental health challenge, and who was also artistic, and she grew up in that environment. Now her mom was also in terms of recent history anyway, her mom was a feminist at a time when it was more radical than it is today to be a feminist, which is interesting. Now, so kind of an earlier feminist, you could say, in the history of like American feminism anyway. And she was really a fighter for women's rights. And she grew up in that environment where her mother encouraged that. You see that you get that quality of the moon and Mars coming together so strongly here. She was also, there was an environment of violence and hostility toward women in her early childhood. And then these conditions were, and still are, a huge part of what ended up shaping her life. She would go on in many aspects of her life as an adult to become an activist specifically interested in women's rights. Now, in terms of her life path, and that's just a brief picture, there was a lot more there, but just so you can feel how that moon, Venus, and Mars showed up in relation to the topics or themes that I started off talking about. The sun in the 5th house. What has she done? Her life, she went and received a BFA in painting, I believe it was. And so she's been an artist and set designer. So she did set designing and some costume designing and then painting. And she's been a lifelong career artist. Now she's lived kind of close-ish to, that same, like, I don't know, the poverty line isn't the right phrase, but the way she put it, I think, was it's been a struggle to make ends meet. There's been kind of that theme. There's that Mars again in the 2nd house, but she's been kind of an activist and an artist. And you've got the 5th house Libra, the creativity. It's so important to her path and the way that it played into what both of her parents did for a living. A set designer like her father, her mother was a dancer. So I thought that was really interesting. Now here's the really interesting part. What about that Saturn in the 9th house that I mentioned? Well, I think it was earlier on in her adult life. I don't remember the timing exactly now, but she became deeply committed to Zen Buddhism, which, as you know, is a kind of monastic tradition. It has a long lineage. It's very, I don't want to say stoic, so that's not the right word, but it's a practice that requires a lot of maturity and a lot of discipline. You've got to stick with it. The mindfulness practices, the meditation practices, and that's been an anchor for her. So she's actually been a part of leadership within larger faith communities of Buddhism. So I thought this was just such a great chart example because it pulls together so many of the core elements of craft that we study in my course. So, again, that's just giving you the natal context so that we can talk meaningfully about the Saturn return in the 9th that's coming up, that has a lot to do with a kind of review, a life review in relation to things like faith, beliefs. So that has a lot more context in being able to see the role that Saturn has played in the life story. Right? We can talk about, her transit. She's got a transit from Uranus down the road, opposing her moon in Scorpio. We can talk about, mom and family and so forth. Being able to look forward in a chart is not possible unless you have understood the parameters of the natal karma. So these little techniques, they're very simple, right? They're rooted in basic house meanings, basic things like essential dignity, some basic aspects that we look at, and so forth. So if you are, someone who's just studying on your own, hopefully these little videos, like I said, just give you something good to study from. And if you are someone who's thinking about studying more and you have questions, feel free to email me, info@nightlightastrology.com. Like I said, the new class starts in November on Saturdays. I think it's the 14th of November that it begins. Here, let me just check that really quick. So yeah, it's Saturday the 14th of November is when my next one-year program starts. There's 30 classes in a year plus 12 guest lecturers. We go through all of the fundamentals of ancient horoscopic astrology, and then by the end of the program, last 9 or 10 lessons out of the 30, we have live clients come in, and you get to see me actually work with people and putting these techniques into practice, and that's a vital part of learning astrology, is being able to see readings being done. So if you're interested, again, check it out on my website, nightlightastrology.com. The early bird rate is available, as are payment plans. Or if you're interested in receiving need-based tuition because you're struggling due to COVID-19, just feel free to reach out. There's a need-based tuition on the website as well. All right, that's what I've got. I hope you guys are having a great week, and I hope the audio video wasn't too grainy, considering that I'm sitting on a mattress in an empty house. All right, take it easy, everyone. Bye.